Alright, I just stumbled upon this amazing article by Josh about CSS grids. But in this video, I especially want to talk about the grid areas concept in CSS Grid. Now firstly, shout out to Josh because this is an entire article explaining CSS grids and he has done that amazing in a visual aspect as well as when it comes to explaining things the right way. I really suggest you to come to this website and go through this article if you want to master CSS grids, but I especially want to talk about grid areas when it comes to CSS Grid by taking reference of this article. And grid areas is also a concept that's being asked or gaining popularity during interviews as well. So I think learning this concept should really make your life easier, not just when it comes to interviews, but also when it comes to coding, because this concept is really a game changer if you work with grids in CSS. So let's just go through this section of this article and code this out as well to get a better understanding of what grid areas are. Alright, so as you can see here, let's suppose we are building this layout. Alright, so this is a very typical layout in websites where there's the header, the sidebar and the main section. So using what we have learned so far, we could structure it like this. So basically if you do not use grid areas, then generally you would have to use all of this to be able to simulate something like this. Alright, so what he's doing over here is there is a parent class grid. Hold up, before I explain you all of this part, I have actually made sure that in Stack Blitz over here, I create its HTML layout, basically the HTML layout of this CSS counterpart. So this is how the HTML part is going to look like. It's pretty simple. So there's basically going to be a parent div, which is going to be having a class name of grid. Then it's going to have three different divs within the parent grid, which is nothing but sidebar, header, and main. And now we need to structure this using the normal grid approach, which is without grid areas, to make sure it looks like this. So when we have this HTML layout, to get this output, or basically this HTML layout over here, this is the CSS we require. Basically just this part. So what we're doing over here is I basically pasted everything from the article over here and I just added these two lines in the sidebar and this border and the border again over here in the main and header to give you a proper reference of where each sections are present. So without the grid areas approach, to get this layout, all we're doing is to the parent we're giving it a display of grid, which means that all these child elements can now use the CSS grid property. Then we're targeting the columns part and specifying that there are going to be two columns, which is wherein the first column is going to be of 2 fractional unit and the second column is going to be 5 fractional unit. So the second one's bigger than the first one, but it's going to have 2 columns. And then we have specified rows over here, meaning that we're going to have 2 rows over here. So the first row is going to be this part and the second row is going to be this part. So if I go to this diagram over here, you can see this is the first row, this is the second row, and this is the first column, this is the second column. So here you can see, since we are specifying 2 rows, the first row is only going to be 50 px in height and the remaining portion of the row is going to be taken by this 1 fractional unit. Alright, so after that, all we have to do is, without using grid areas, if you want to achieve this layout, then we have to individually position the sidebar, header and main to their respective positions. So for example here, to the sidebar we are saying take the grid column 1. So the sidebar is going to occupy the entire grid column of 1, basically the first column. All this is saying is, hey sidebar, occupy the first grid column. So the first column is going to be occupied by the sidebar. And then we are saying grid row 1 by 3, which here means that take the entire available row accordingly. Basically stretch your height so you take the entire available row within your confined column space. So 1 by 3 here, if I had to explain you what this means. So when we say, hey sidebar, take grid column 1, basically take the first column and span it across the entire row. So 1 by 3 here means span it across the entire height of your available space. And why is it 1 by 3? Well, it's 3 because we count here by the number of lines and not by the number of boxes. So this is line number 1, line number 2 and line number 3. So when we say 1 by 3, it means take the entire part of your available column space. The available column space is grid column 1 and 1 by 3 means take the entire space. Alright, so that's what the sidebar does. So this part is taken by the sidebar. So if you notice, you're having to manually position the sidebar. Similarly for the header, we're saying take the grid column 2, which is this part. This is the column 2. So for the header, we are saying take the grid column 2, which is somewhere in this part, but make sure you confine yourself till the first row. And we know the first row is this part. So the header is going to take the column 2, but only the first part of the row. Had we written 1 by 3 here as well, then the header would have spanned across this entire space. But because we have only written grid row 1, then it's going to stay confined till here, and this is the second column. Then all we do is we tell to the main, take the grid column 2, which is obvious because this is again present in the second column. So in the grid column 2, take the second row, which is this part over here, the second row, because this is the second row. So in the grid column 2, take the second row. Alright, so we had to manually position the sidebar, header and main to be able to achieve this layout. Now, if we had to do this in a much simpler way without having to manually position each of these sections to get this layout, how would we do that? Well, that's where grid areas come into the picture. They make things really simple as if we are just writing plain English. So if I was supposed to go down, here it says this works, but there's a more ergonomic way to do this, which is grid areas. And here's what it looks like. Now just compare this code with the one above. If you see here, this is the parent part, which has this, which is similar or same to this, right? We are just specifying the layouts, basically 2 columns and 2 rows, and they're going to have the respective width and height. And the only different thing we're doing is we are specifying this, which is the grid template areas. So don't mind this part over here because this is just saying which tab is selected. So if I change this to header, this changes to header. If I change this to main, this changes to main. So don't pay attention to this, but just know that this entire part, which we were doing manually using CSS grids, can be replaced with just this much if we use grid areas. So how does this work? Well, instead of using all of these 3, all we can do is we can say grid template areas, and then we just have to mention some properties. So if you have to understand what this means, then all this says is, hey, I want the first part to be the sidebar. Basically in the grid template column, I want the first part to be the sidebar and the second part to be the header. So all this part is saying is, before I explain you, let's go down and read this. So here it says, like before, we are defining the grid structure, grid template columns and grid template rows, like we were doing before. But then we have this curious declaration. All right. So here's how this works. We are drawing out the grid we want to create almost as if we were making ASCII art. Each line represents a row and each word is a name we are giving to a particular slice of the grid. So each of this line is a row. All right. And each of this is a part of the grid. So let's say this part would be this row. All right, because this is a row, right? So this part would be this row and this part would be this row. All right, and each of these individually refer to nothing but each of these slices of the grid. So if I'm saying sidebar header, then it means since we have already defined our grid structure, which is nothing but 2 columns and 2 rows, and the first row is going to only have 50 px, the second row is going to take the remaining space. Then similarly over here, the first row is going to have 50 px and this is going to take the remaining space, and they both take the remaining height accordingly. So here we are saying this part is going to refer to the sidebar, then the second slice of the grid, which is this, is going to refer to the header, then again this part is going to take the sidebar and the second part is going to take the main. So rather than having to position each of these manually, we can just write it down in plain English the way we actually see it on the screen, which is so cool, right? Which makes our code super easy and super maintainable and super easy to read. So as you can see here, see how it sort of looks like the grid visually? Then instead of assigning a child with grid column and grid row, we assign it with grid area. When we want a particular area to span multiple rows or columns, we can repeat the name of that area in our template. For example, we wanted sidebar to span across these 2 columns, right? To span across these 2 rows, right? So if you want to do that, we can simply mention it twice, sidebar and sidebar. So in this example, the sidebar area spans both rows, and so we write sidebar for both cells in the first column. So in the first column, we write sidebar twice, which says take the sidebar twice in the first column, which means cover this entire part, right? Just exactly the way you see it visually. And then similarly, header and main, which is nothing but this and this, which is nothing but the second column, which spans nothing but this part. So the second column's first row is header, the second column's second row is main, which is this. So exactly how you see things visually, right? So this is basically how grid areas work, and I think it's a super amazing concept, and I really think you should use this frequently in your projects because it really improves the maintainability of your code. Now, as a last thing, just to see this in action in our own code editor, what I'll do is I'll try to replace our old code, the manual approach, with this grid areas concept. So first of all, what I can do is I can actually copy this part, then go to my editor. And here, what I can do here is I can actually replace this dot grid with nothing but the part that we copied. I'll paste that here. All right. Now with that done, I can actually remove all of this manual positioning from here. So just like that, and like that. Then I need to make sure that I name this as dot grid. And then to make sure the grid template areas comes into effect, if you go over to the article here, then it says it should have nothing but dot child. Basically, the dot child is nothing but either the sidebar, header, or main. It should have a grid area specifying which part it is, whether the sidebar, header, or main. So I'll copy this. Actually, I don't have to copy the entire thing. I can just copy this part because we have our child classes written over here. Now here I have removed the manual positioning code, and all I have to do is I have to just paste this and tell our CSS grid that this grid area is nothing but the sidebar. So it's going to map this to this and this. Similarly, I'll copy this, paste it here, inform our grid area that this is the header, and I'll paste this here and say that this is the main. All right, and voila, you can see this also works exactly the way our old manual positioning was working as. So basically, rather than having to manually position this, count which row, column to put things in, this is so much more visually easier. Like sidebar, header, so sidebar, header, sidebar, main. And then we just go to those individual child elements and specify which part it is. Basically, we attach a naming reference to it. Like this is the sidebar, so its grid area is going to be the sidebar, denoting this. This is the header, its grid slice is going to be the header. This is the main, so its grid slice is going to be the main. And these two things, the border and height, is just something I've added externally to help you visualize things properly. So let's say if we had an image within each of these grids, then we wouldn't have had to add any of this part. If I remove, let's say, all three of this, you can see this is our layout and how small, short, and easy to read our code is. I'll just bring that back again. So this is pretty much all about the grid areas in CSS Grid. Now with that, we're done with this video. If you found it insightful, drop a like and subscribe for more.